The annual academic conference was one of the most prestigious intellectual gatherings in the country, a place where the brightest young minds came together to challenge ideas, debate theories, and showcase their intellectual prowess. It was a stage for America's top students, handpicked from the nation's elite institutions, to engage in discussions that pushed the boundaries of philosophy, science, and human understanding. Professors and scholars from renowned universities attended not only to mentor but also to assert their intellectual dominance. These events were not just academic forums, but battlegrounds for ideas, where those who could dismantle traditional values in the name of progressive thought often gained the most recognition. The underlying culture of superiority was palpable, with many attendees taking pride in their ability to outmaneuver others in debate, viewing it as a test of mental agility rather than a genuine pursuit of truth. The conference was not for the faint of heart. It was a place where only the most confident, the most well-prepared, and the most articulate could hope to command respect. Among those present was Barron Trump, a young man who had earned his place through sheer academic excellence. Despite his accomplishments, whispers circulated among the attendees. Some students, eager to prove their own worth, dismissed him as someone who had been invited only because of his last name. The weight of his family's legacy was both an asset and a burden. Some saw him as a figure of privilege rather than an intellectual equal. They expected him to be out of place among the academic elite, assuming he could not hold his own against the rigorous debates that defined the event. What they did not realize was that before the day was over, Barron Trump would silence every doubt, not with arrogance or defensiveness, but with a calm and measured display of intellectual strength. As the students gathered in the grand lecture hall that morning, there was a tangible energy in the air. Conversations buzzed about the upcoming speakers, but one name stood out: Professor Nathaniel Carter. He was a figure both revered and feared, a man who had built his reputation on his sharp wit and even sharper tongue. Known for his relentless critiques of traditional values, particularly religion, he took pride in dismantling faith through logic, statistics, and scientific reasoning. His lectures were not just educational, they were performances, grand spectacles, where faith became the punchline and belief in God was mocked as outdated superstition. He was the kind of professor who thrived on intellectual combat, a self-proclaimed champion of rationality who viewed faith as nothing more than a crutch for weak minds. His debates were legendary, often described as intellectual gladiator matches, where those who dared to challenge him rarely left unscathed. This was the environment in which Barron Trump found himself. The students who filled the hall were eager, some looking forward to Carter's usual show of intellectual superiority, others simply hoping to witness an intense debate. Few expected anything out of the ordinary. What they didn't know was that today's match would have an unexpected champion, one who would stand his ground in a way that none of them, including Carter himself, had anticipated. Professor Nathaniel Carter was not just an academic. He was a performer, a master of rhetoric who commanded lecture halls with the confidence of a man who had never lost a debate. Over the years, he had built a formidable reputation as one of the sharpest intellectuals in his field, known for his ability to deconstruct arguments with ruthless efficiency. His specialty was dismantling traditional beliefs, particularly religious faith, which he viewed as an outdated relic of a less enlightened time. To him, faith was not just an error in thinking, but a sign of intellectual weakness, something to be exposed and ridiculed in the pursuit of what he called true intelligence. Students idolized him for his brutal honesty, his unapologetic dismissal of anything he considered irrational, and the way he could turn complex scientific principles into weapons against those who still clung to religious convictions. To be in one of Carter's lectures was to witness a spectacle, an intellectual takedown that left his opponents scrambling, struggling to recover under the weight of his arguments. On this particular morning, as students filled the grand lecture hall, an eager energy crackled in the air. Everyone knew Carter's reputation. His lectures weren't just about imparting knowledge. They were intellectual battlegrounds, arenas where he publicly dismantled ideas he deemed foolish. His targets were often religious students who dared to voice their beliefs, and his audience relished the show, knowing that few could withstand his merciless logic. Today, as he took his place at the podium, adjusting his glasses and surveying the crowd, He exuded the same unshakable confidence that had made him a legend in academic circles. He knew how this would go. He had seen it play out time and time again. A question would be raised about religion, perhaps a student would try to defend it, and Carter would tear their arguments apart, demonstrating the intellectual superiority of reason over faith. It was a script he had followed for years, and it had never failed him. With a smirk, he leaned forward slightly, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let's address the elephant in the room," he declared, letting his gaze sweep over the audience before settling briefly on Barron Trump. "Studies consistently show an inverse correlation between intelligence and religious belief," he continued, pausing for effect. "In simpler terms, for those who might need it." His eyes flickered toward Barron. "The smarter you are, the less likely you are to believe in supernatural fantasies." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room, though some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Behind him, the massive screen flickered to life, displaying a sharply declining graph. Carter gestured toward it with a flourish. "This is what happens to religious belief as IQ and education levels rise. Fascinating, isn't it?" He let the question hang in the air for effect before adding almost offhandedly, "Though I suppose some people's family traditions," he cast another pointed glance at Barron, "make it harder for them to accept basic cognitive development." The laughter in the room was more subdued this time, with some students glancing between Carter and Barron, unsure if they should be amused or uncomfortable. At the back of the room, Professor Henry Wallace, a senior faculty member, watched with growing concern. He had seen Carter be provocative before, but this felt different. This was personal. Carter, however, was just getting started. He continued, his voice carrying the same self-assured authority as always. "You know what I find truly remarkable?" he said, sweeping his gaze across the room. "We have some of the brightest young minds in America gathered here today. Future scientists, leaders, thinkers. And yet, I guarantee some of you still cling to these primitive beliefs, unable to break free from your cognitive limitations." This time, more students chuckled, though others looked down at their desks, avoiding eye contact. Through it all, Barron Trump remained perfectly still. Unlike the other students, who either laughed nervously or looked away, he didn't flinch. He didn't shift in his seat, didn't avert his gaze. Instead, he met Carter's eyes head-on, unwavering. There was something in that steady composure that seemed to irritate the professor even further. Carter narrowed his eyes, leaning forward slightly as he removed his glasses and placed them on the podium. "Tell me," he challenged, his voice laced with sarcasm, "what does it say about someone's intellectual capacity when they still believe in an invisible sky daddy in 2025, when their cognitive development is so stunted that they need a fairy tale to explain the world?" His eyes locked onto Barron, his smirk widening. "Perhaps," he added, "some of our more politically connected students would care to enlighten us." The tension in the room was suffocating. Some students held their breath, their eyes darting between Carter and Barron. It was clear what was happening. This wasn't just an academic lecture anymore. This was a public challenge, a direct attack meant to humiliate. No one, not even Carter himself, was prepared for what happened next. Barron Trump slowly stood up, and a murmur spread through the room. He didn't rush, didn't falter. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, and measured. "Actually, Professor," he said, his words cutting through the thick silence, "I'd be happy to address your concerns about cognitive development." A flicker of amusement crossed Carter's face. "Well, well," he said, gesturing theatrically. "Young Mr. Trump wants to educate us about intellectual capacity. Please, enlighten us. Tell us how your God fits into the modern world of quantum physics and artificial intelligence." A few students chuckled, sensing an impending takedown. But Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he met Carter's gaze evenly and said, "First, I find it interesting that someone who prides himself on intellectual rigor is making the assumption that belief in God equates to a lack of intelligence. That's not science, Professor. That's bias." The room went completely silent. Carter's smirk faltered, just slightly, but enough for Professor Wallace to notice. For the first time, the script was about to change. The atmosphere in the grand lecture hall had shifted. What had begun as yet another performance by Professor Nathaniel Carter, an intellectual showcase where he would systematically dismantle faith before an eager audience, was now taking an unexpected turn. Barron Trump, the young man many had whispered about, the one some assumed was only present due to his last name, had risen from his seat. The murmurs in the room grew, students exchanging quick glances, wondering if this would be the moment Carter crushed yet another student who dared to challenge him. Carter himself, standing confidently at the podium, had the look of a man who had already won before the battle even began. His smirk widened as he gestured toward Barron with theatrical amusement. "Well, well," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "Young Mr. Trump wants to educate us about intellectual capacity. Please, enlighten us. Tell us how your God fits into the modern world of quantum physics and artificial intelligence." A few students chuckled, sensing an easy takedown. Carter had spent years refining his methods, perfecting his ability to expose religious belief as intellectually inferior. He thrived on it. He had made a career of turning faith into a joke and those who defended it into objects of ridicule. Most students who dared to question him faltered under his pressure, stumbling over their words, grasping at weak defenses that he could dismantle in mere seconds. He expected the same from Barron, perhaps a nervous attempt to argue for faith, perhaps an appeal to tradition, but what he did not expect was the calm, steady resolve that met his gaze. Barron did not stammer, did not shift uncomfortably, and did not avert his eyes as so many before him had. Instead, he stood there with the quiet confidence of someone who had prepared for this moment, not because he had sought it out, but because he had long understood the battle that had just been thrust upon him. "First," Barron began, his voice even, unshaken, "I find it interesting that someone who prides himself on intellectual rigor is making the assumption that belief in God equates to a lack of intelligence. That's not science, Professor. That's bias." The laughter in the room died instantly. The smirk on Carter's face twitched ever so slightly before he masked it with feigned amusement. The students, many of whom had been anticipating a humiliating defeat for Barron, now found themselves sitting straighter, paying closer attention. Carter, ever quick to regain control, scoffed. "Bias?" he repeated, shaking his head. "My dear boy, the only bias here is that of religious tradition, clinging desperately to relevance in a world that has long since outgrown it. Do you deny the correlation between intelligence and declining religious belief?" He gestured again toward the massive screen behind him where the graph showing the supposed inverse relationship between IQ and faith still loomed over the audience. Barron took a step forward, undeterred. "Correlation does not equal causation, Professor," he said, his voice measured, deliberate. "That's a fundamental statistical error, one that someone of your academic standing should know better than to make." A murmur spread through the hall. Even those who had initially sided with Carter were now intrigued by Barron's quick, precise counter. Carter's jaw clenched ever so slightly, but he forced a laugh, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, come now, let's not get lost in semantics," he said. "The fact remains that as education levels rise, religious belief declines. The numbers don't lie." Barron nodded. "No, numbers don't lie, but how we interpret them can be misleading. If you were truly committed to intellectual honesty, you would acknowledge that some of the greatest scientific minds in history, Newton, Max Planck, Francis Collins, have acknowledged the role of a higher power in the universe. Even Einstein himself once said, 'Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind.'" The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't just students waiting for Carter's next move. It was the weight of a shift. The realization that Barron was not just holding his own, but exposing cracks in the professor's usual narrative. Carter, sensing the change, straightened his posture and narrowed his eyes. "Oh, please," he scoffed. "Are we really going to appeal to ancient history? Newton lived in a time when alchemy was considered a legitimate science. Shall we also defend astrology while we're at it?" A few forced chuckles from the audience, but far fewer than before. Barron didn't take the bait. "The passage of time does not invalidate intellectual contributions," he countered. "And if you want more contemporary names, I can give you plenty. But let's not move the goalposts, Professor. We were discussing bias, and I think it's clear that the real bias in this room isn't coming from faith." It's coming from the assumption that faith and intelligence are mutually exclusive. Carter's smirk wavered. Professor Wallace, still seated in the back of the room, watched with interest. He had never seen Carter rattled like this before. Normally, by this point in a debate, the student in question would be retreating, struggling to keep up, desperate to find a way out. But Barron was still standing, still calm, still completely in control of his argument. Carter cleared his throat, shifting his stance. But you see, he said, religion doesn't just claim to be a philosophy. It claims to be truth, and yet not one shred of empirical evidence has ever proven the existence of a divine being. Science operates on evidence, logic, reason. Faith operates on, he smirked, let's call it wishful thinking. Barron tilted his head slightly. Tell me, Professor, he said, his voice unwavering. Do you believe in human rights? Carter frowned slightly. Of course I do. Do you believe in justice, in love, in moral truth? Obviously, Carter snapped. Barron nodded. And yet none of those things are scientifically quantifiable. You cannot put justice under a microscope, you cannot measure love with a ruler, and yet we believe in them because we recognize their existence in ways beyond empirical testing. He took another step forward. The real question, Professor, isn't whether faith and intelligence can coexist. It's whether a man so committed to his own intellectual pride can admit that he might not have all the answers. The hall was silent. Carter's smirk was gone. Students who had initially smirked along with him now sat frozen, their eyes fixed on Barron, realizing that something remarkable was happening. The script had been rewritten. The intellectual gladiator match had taken an unexpected turn, and for the first time it was Professor Carter who was on the defensive. The air in the grand lecture hall was thick with tension, a silent anticipation hanging between Professor Carter and Barron Trump as all eyes remained fixed on them. What had begun as yet another one of Carter's intellectual performances, an opportunity to mock faith under the guise of academic debate, was now something entirely different. Carter had expected Barron to react with hesitation, with uncertainty, with the usual nervous scrambling of a student caught in the crosshairs of a superior intellect. Instead, Barron stood tall, his expression calm and unreadable, his gaze locked onto the professor with a quiet confidence that seemed to unsettle the very man who had sought to humiliate him. It wasn't arrogance, it was certainty, the kind that comes not from blind belief, but from a foundation of reason that had been tested and refined. When Barron finally spoke, his voice was measured, carrying none of the emotion Carter had likely hoped to provoke. First, he began, his tone even, unwavering, I find it interesting that someone who prides himself on intellectual rigor is making the assumption that belief in God equates to a lack of intelligence. That's not science, Professor. That's bias. A ripple moved through the audience, a subtle but undeniable shift as students leaned forward in their seats, their initial amusement giving way to curiosity. Professor Carter's smirk twitched, but he quickly masked it with feigned amusement, waving a dismissive hand. Bias? He echoed, his voice carrying the same condescension he had perfected over years of debates. My dear boy, the only bias here is that of religious tradition, clinging desperately to relevance in a world that has long since outgrown it. Do you deny the overwhelming data that suggests a decline in religious belief as intelligence and education levels rise? He gestured toward the large screen behind him, where the sharply declining graph still loomed over the audience like a pronouncement of absolute truth. Barron didn't glance at the screen. He didn't need to. No one denies that correlation exists, he said, his voice steady, but correlation does not equal causation. That's a fundamental statistical error, one that someone of your academic standing should know better than to make. A murmur spread through the lecture hall, not loud but significant. Even those who had been enjoying Carter's earlier remarks now found themselves intrigued, watching as Barron met the professor's challenge head-on. Carter's jaw tensed slightly, but he forced a chuckle, shaking his head. Oh, let's not get lost in semantics, he said, though the usual ease in his voice was fading. The fact remains that as education increases, religious belief declines. The numbers don't lie. Barron tilted his head slightly. No, numbers don't lie, he agreed, but interpretation of those numbers can. If you were truly committed to intellectual honesty, you would acknowledge that some of the greatest scientific minds in history, Isaac Newton, Max Planck, Francis Collins, believed in a higher power. Even Albert Einstein himself once said, "Science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind." Are you saying they were all victims of cognitive underdevelopment? The silence that followed was thick, heavier than before. This time it wasn't just the students waiting for Carter's next response. It was the realization that Barron was not just defending himself, but exposing the cracks in the professor's argument. Carter's usual confidence wavered for a fraction of a second before he forced a scoff. "Oh, please," he said, "are we really going to appeal to ancient history? Newton lived in a time when alchemy was considered a legitimate science. Shall we also defend astrology while we're at it?" A few chuckles rippled through the room, but they lacked the conviction they had carried earlier. Barron remained composed. "The passage of time does not invalidate intellectual contributions," he countered. "And if you want contemporary names, I can give you plenty. But let's not move the goalposts, Professor. We were discussing bias, and I think it's clear that the real bias in this room isn't coming from faith. It's coming from the assumption that intelligence and belief in God are mutually exclusive." Carter narrowed his eyes, shifting slightly at the podium, clearly not accustomed to being challenged so directly without the other party crumbling under pressure. Professor Henry Wallace, still seated in the back of the room, watched with keen interest. He had attended many of Carter's lectures, had witnessed the professor dismantle countless students with ease. But this was different. Barron wasn't just holding his own, he was controlling the flow of the discussion. Carter cleared his throat. But you see," he said, regaining some of his composure, "religion doesn't just claim to be a philosophy, it claims to be truth. And yet not one shred of empirical evidence has ever proven the existence of a divine being. Science operates on evidence, logic, reason. Faith operates on—" He smirked. "Let's call it wishful thinking." Barron met his gaze without flinching. "Tell me, Professor," he said, his voice unwavering, "do you believe in human rights?" Carter frowned slightly, caught off guard. "Of course I do. Do you believe in justice, in love, in moral truth?" "Obviously," Carter snapped, irritated by the direction of the conversation. Barron nodded. "And yet none of those things are scientifically quantifiable. You cannot put justice under a microscope, you cannot measure love with a ruler, and yet we believe in them because we recognize their existence in ways beyond empirical testing." He took another step forward. "The real question, Professor, isn't whether faith and intelligence can coexist. It's whether a man so committed to his own intellectual pride can admit that he might not have all the answers." The hall was silent. The usual easy arrogance on Carter's face had faded, replaced with something else, something closer to unease. Students who had been watching the exchange like spectators at a gladiator match now found themselves drawn into something more profound. Barron wasn't just winning an argument, he was forcing people to think. Carter opened his mouth as if to speak, but for the first time in years no words came. Barron Trump had not simply responded to the professor's challenge, he had turned the challenge back on him, and the entire room knew it. A hush had settled over the grand lecture hall, the kind of silence that wasn't merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something far more profound. An unspoken realization that the expected script of the day had been rewritten. Professor Carter, the man who had built his career on tearing down religious belief with sharp wit and biting sarcasm, had just been met with something he hadn't anticipated. A challenge not based on emotion or blind faith, but on logic and reason, as precise as the arguments he himself wielded. Barron Trump stood firm, his posture unshaken, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who not only understood the weight of his words, but had the confidence to wield them with precision. He had not merely answered Carter's attempts at ridicule, he had exposed the weakness in his foundation. And yet, Barron was not done. Professor Carter had spent years debating students, reducing their beliefs to dust with the same practiced lines and statistics. But this time was different. This time he was facing someone who wasn't just defending faith, he was dismantling the professor's own biases. Barron took another measured step forward, his expression calm. You claim that religious belief is a sign of intellectual deficiency, he said, his voice carrying across the room with deliberate clarity. Yet some of the greatest scientific minds in history, Newton, Planck, Francis Collins, have openly acknowledged the role of a higher power in the universe. Would you argue that their intelligence was compromised because they believed in something greater than themselves? Carter forced a smirk, though the confidence behind it wavered slightly. Ah, yes, the appeal to authority, he said, waving a dismissive hand. You do realize that Newton also dabbled in alchemy? Shall we defend that as well? Science progresses, Mr. Trump. We don't cling to outdated beliefs simply because great minds of the past held them. Barron did not blink. The passage of time does not negate the contributions of those who laid the foundation for modern science, he countered smoothly. And if you want more contemporary names, I can provide plenty. But let's not move the goalposts. We were discussing bias, and I think it's clear that the real bias in this room isn't coming from faith. It's coming from your assumption that intelligence and religious belief are mutually exclusive. A few students exchanged glances. Carter was used to controlling the flow of these discussions, but Barron had taken the reins. Professor Wallace, still seated in the back, watched with interest. He had never seen Carter pushed into a defensive stance before. Carter exhaled sharply. Belief in God isn't just outdated, it's unscientific, he pressed, gripping the podium as if steadying himself. There is no empirical evidence for the existence of a divine being. Science operates on reason, on logic, on provable data. Faith is built on... He smirked. Let's call it wishful thinking. Barron met his gaze, unwavering. Tell me, Professor, he said, his voice unshaken. Do you believe in human rights? Carter's brow furrowed slightly, clearly caught off guard. Of course I do, he replied. Do you believe in justice, in love, in moral truth? Obviously. Barron nodded slightly. And yet, none of those things can be measured in a laboratory. You cannot put justice under a microscope, nor quantify love with an equation. You cannot physically prove the concept of inherent human rights, and yet we base entire societies on the belief that they exist. He took another step forward. So, Professor, I ask you this. Why is it that faith in God is dismissed as irrational, yet faith in these unprovable concepts is considered noble and enlightened? The silence in the room deepened. Carter opened his mouth, then closed it, his usual quick rebuttals failing to form. Students who had laughed at his earlier jokes now sat still, their attention entirely locked on Barron. The professor cleared his throat, shifting slightly, attempting to regain control. The difference, he said, though his voice lacked its previous edge, is that morality, justice, and human rights are social constructs, ideas that evolved over time to benefit civilization. Barron nodded. And yet, civilizations throughout history have recognized a moral order, often tied to faith. Even today, societies across the world, regardless of scientific advancement, continue to hold religious beliefs while making progress in technology, medicine, and philosophy. You see, Professor, the real debate isn't about whether faith and intelligence can coexist. It's about whether someone so committed to their own intellectual pride can admit they might not have all the answers. A ripple moved through the audience. It was no longer just a debate. It was something deeper, something that forced everyone in the room to reevaluate what they had assumed to be true. Carter's face hardened, but he could not hide the unease creeping into his expression. Barron took a breath, his next words deliberate. You claim that belief in God is a crutch for the weak-minded, he said, his voice calm but firm. Yet here you stand, using your academic position as a crutch to ridicule those who disagree with you. So tell me, Professor, which is more indicative of intellectual insecurity, having faith in something greater than ourselves, or needing to mock others in order to feel superior? The impact of his words settled over the room like a weight. Carter clenched his jaw, gripping the podium tightly. The smirk was gone. The usual smug amusement had vanished. For the first time, the professor, who had made a career of belittling belief, found himself without an immediate answer. Barron let the silence linger before delivering the final blow. You argue that faith in God is irrational, he said, his voice measured. Yet you have faith that consciousness arose from unconscious matter, that life emerged from non-life, that order came from chaos, all without any divine guidance. So tell me, Professor, Which requires more blind faith? The room was utterly still. Professor Carter's mouth opened slightly, then closed. No words came. The man who had dominated intellectual debates for years, who had left countless students flustered and embarrassed, now stood speechless before the very student he had sought to humiliate. At the back of the room, Professor Wallace leaned forward slightly, watching his colleague's carefully constructed intellectual superiority begin to crumble. Carter had always prided himself on his ability to dismantle opposing arguments with ease, but today, in front of a room full of students who had expected yet another easy victory for their professor, something unexpected had happened. Carter had not merely lost control of the debate, he had lost the very certainty upon which he had built his authority. And everyone in the room knew it. For the first time in his career, Professor Nathaniel Carter found himself without a response. The man who had spent years perfecting his rhetorical dominance, who had turned faith into an intellectual punching bag, now stood at his podium gripping its edges with white-knuckled intensity, his mouth slightly open but no words coming out. The silence in the grand lecture hall was suffocating, thick with the weight of an unexpected turn of events. Students who had once chuckled at his cutting remarks now sat frozen, eyes flickering between Carter and Barron Trump, waiting for the professor to reclaim his usual authority. But something had changed. Barron had not just held his own, he had reversed the flow of the debate entirely, forcing Carter onto the defensive in a way no one had ever done before, and the professor knew it. Professor Henry Wallace, still seated at the back of the room, watched the scene unfold with quiet fascination. He had seen Carter dismantle countless students before, reducing them to hesitant, stuttering messes under the force of his intellect. But Barron was different. He was calm, methodical, and utterly unshaken. Where other students had collapsed under Carter's scrutiny, Barron had stood his ground and, in doing so, had exposed something few had ever seen: Carter's own intellectual insecurity. It was subtle but undeniable. The slight twitch of his jaw, the way he exhaled sharply, forcing himself to regain composure, the way his eyes darted across the room, no longer filled with smug certainty but with a flicker of doubt. Carter cleared his throat, finally managing to speak, though his voice lacked its usual effortless confidence. He began, but stopped just as quickly. He picked up his glasses from the podium, fiddling with them for a moment, his mind racing for an escape route, for something, anything, that would allow him to regain control. But Barron had taken something from him in this debate, something that could not be easily recovered: the illusion of his absolute intellectual superiority. The students were no longer watching Carter with admiration. They were watching him with curiosity, with scrutiny, as if seeing him for the first time without the protective shield of his usual arrogance. A few whispered amongst themselves, their eyes darting toward Barron, who had not moved, had not smirked, had not gloated. He had simply stood there, his presence steady, his words still hanging in the air. The contrast between the two men was stark. One was scrambling for footing, the other standing with unwavering confidence. Finally, Carter let out a forced chuckle, shaking his head as if dismissing the entire exchange. "Well," he muttered, his voice tight, "let's move on." But everyone in that room knew the truth. Barron Trump had just won a battle that no one had expected him to fight, and Carter had no idea how to recover from it. The lecture hall remained unnervingly silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Professor Carter, the man who had spent decades reducing faith to a relic of ignorance, had just faced an argument he was wholly unprepared for. He stood at the podium, his fingers gripping the edges tightly, his usual air of effortless superiority now overshadowed by something unfamiliar: uncertainty. Across from him, Barron Trump had not moved, his expression calm, his posture unwavering. He had just turned the entire debate on its head, not by appealing to emotion, not by resorting to desperate defenses, but by using the very weapons Carter had always prided himself on: logic, reason, and undeniable truth. The professor had always framed religion as a crutch for the weak, an intellectual failure, a belief system that existed only in the absence of evidence. But Barron had just forced him to confront an uncomfortable reality. His own position was not as unassailable as he had always assumed. Barron took a single step forward, his voice steady, measured, unshaken. "Professor, you argue that faith is irrational, that it is a sign of lower intelligence," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "But let's take a moment to examine your own faith. The faith that consciousness arose from unconscious matter, that life emerged from non-life, that order came from chaos, all without any guiding force. You mock belief in a higher power as unscientific, yet you hold to a worldview that requires just as much, if not more, faith in the unknown." He let the words hang for a moment, allowing them to settle over the room. Carter opened his mouth to interject, but Barron continued before he could regain his footing. "You see, Professor, the real question isn't whether faith and intelligence can coexist. The real question is this: which requires more blind faith, believing in a creator or believing that nothing created everything?" A visible shift occurred in the room. Students who had previously chuckled at Carter's mockery of religion were now exchanging glances, their expressions thoughtful, uncertain. For years they had heard their professor dismantle religious arguments with ease, had seen him pick apart faith with the cold precision of a man who considered himself above such things. And yet here he was, standing before them, unable to answer. Professor Wallace, still seated in the back of the hall, observed the shift with keen interest. He had taught for many years, had seen the way ideological certainty could be shaken by a single moment of clarity. This was one of those moments. Carter's fingers tightened around the podium. His face had darkened, the usual smug amusement wiped away. He exhaled sharply, grasping for an answer, for a way to turn the tide back in his favor. "That's not," he started, but the hesitation in his voice was damning. He knew it. The students knew it. Barron knew it. The balance of power in the debate had irrevocably shifted. Barron took another step forward. "You claim to champion free thought," he said, his voice unwavering. "Yet when confronted with an argument that challenges your assumptions, you mock rather than engage. You ridicule rather than debate. You preach intellectual superiority while displaying intellectual intolerance. So, Professor, tell me, who truly has blind faith? The one who acknowledges the limits of human understanding, or the one who refuses to consider anything beyond his own assumption?" The room was utterly still. For the first time in his long career, Professor Nathaniel Carter had no response. The lecture hall had never felt so silent, so still, as if the very walls had absorbed the weight of what had just transpired. Professor Carter, once a towering figure of intellectual dominance, stood motionless at the podium, his confidence shattered under the weight of an argument he could not refute. The students, who had entered the room expecting yet another masterful takedown of religious belief, now sat frozen in a collective state of disbelief. The energy that once pulsed with eager anticipation for Carter's usual routine had shifted into something unspoken, a quiet recognition that something profound had just taken place. Barron Trump, the young man who had been dismissed by many as a product of his last name, had done what no one had expected. He had not only defended his faith with logic and composure, but he had done so in a way that left even the most hardened skeptics questioning their own assumption. And the most staggering part? He had done it without condescension, without anger, without resorting to the tactics of mockery that Carter himself had employed so effortlessly over the years. Barron, having delivered his final words, did not gloat. He did not revel in Carter's discomfort or look for approval from the audience. Instead, he simply turned and walked back to his seat, his presence still commanding but his demeanor humble. The contrast between him and Carter could not have been more apparent. Where Carter had relied on arrogance and dismissal, Barron had countered with patience and precision. Where Carter had wielded sarcasm like a weapon, Barron had stood firm in reasoned discourse. And now, as Carter remained at the podium, his mind scrambling for a way to recover, the reality of his loss became undeniable. Professor Wallace, still seated at the back of the room, studied the scene with a quiet, knowing expression. He had warned Carter before, had cautioned him against turning intellectual debates into performances designed to belittle rather than enlighten. But Carter had been too confident, too certain that no student could ever truly challenge him. And yet here he was, exposed in a way he had never been before. Finally, Carter cleared his throat, a sound that seemed almost foreign in the room's suffocating quiet. He adjusted his glasses, grasping for something, anything, that might allow him to regain control. "Well," he muttered stiffly, "let's move on." But even as he said it, his voice lacked its usual commanding presence. The words fell flat, hollow, unconvincing. No one in the room believed that things could simply move on. The weight of what had happened could not be brushed aside so easily. The usual aura of dominance that Carter carried in these lectures was gone, replaced by a palpable sense of vulnerability. He knew it. The students knew it. And perhaps for the first time in his career, Carter himself began to question whether he had been as intellectually untouchable as he once believed. As students began quietly gathering their things at the close of the lecture, the usual murmurs of routine discussion were replaced by something different. Whispers, quiet conversations, hushed exchanges of realization. Some cast glances toward Barron, no longer with amusement or skepticism, but with newfound respect. Others, still grappling with what they had witnessed, walked out in deep thought, their minds unsettled in a way they had not expected when they entered the room. Outside the lecture hall, a small group of students hesitated near the exit, as if unable to leave without acknowledging what had just taken place. One of them, a young woman who had laughed at Carter's early remarks, finally spoke. "That was incredible," she said, her voice tinged with something close to awe. A few others nodded, some exchanging knowing looks, others stealing one last glance back at the professor, who remained at the podium, staring at nothing in particular, lost in thought. Back at his seat, Barron did not acknowledge the whispers, did not bask in the quiet admiration that had begun to ripple through the hall. Instead, he simply sat, composed, as if the debate had never been about winning but about standing for what he believed. And perhaps that was the most striking difference of all. Professor Carter had sought to win an argument. Barron had sought to reveal the truth. And in doing so, he had left behind something far greater than a simple victory. He had changed the way people thought. Long after the lecture hall had emptied and the students had gone their separate ways, the weight of what had transpired between Barron Trump and Professor Carter continued to linger. It was no longer just about an academic debate. It had become something far greater. A moment that forced those who had witnessed it to question their own understanding of faith, reason, and the assumptions they had long taken for granted. For years, students had walked into Carter's lectures expecting to be told that religion was an intellectual weakness, a relic of an unenlightened past, a belief system that could not withstand the scrutiny of modern science and rational thought. And yet, in a single afternoon, Barron had dismantled that narrative, not with anger or defiance, but with the very tools Carter himself had wielded against so many others: logic, reason, and an unwavering composure in the face of condescension. He had demonstrated something that many in that room had never truly considered, that faith and intelligence were not enemies, but allies in the search for truth. The debate had started as a battle between two opposing ideologies, one representing pure reason, the other representing faith. But by the time it ended, the clear lines that Carter had sought to draw between them had blurred. Barron had exposed a fundamental contradiction in the professor's argument. Carter had spent years mocking those who believed in something greater than themselves, insisting that all truth must be rooted in empirical evidence, yet he himself had placed blind faith in the idea that everything in existence had come from nothing. He had claimed that faith was irrational, yet he had built his own belief system on unprovable assumptions about consciousness, the origins of life, and the precise conditions that allowed for human existence. In the end, it was not Barron who had been forced to defend his position, it was Carter. And when the moment came for him to offer a rebuttal, to provide the ultimate intellectual counterargument that would crush the opposition as he had done so many times before, he had nothing to say. In the days that followed, word of the debate spread far beyond the walls of that lecture hall. The video of the exchange, captured by a student and uploaded online, quickly gained traction, circulating through academic circles, religious communities, and philosophical discussions alike. Some praised Barron for his courage, for standing against an institution that had long been hostile to faith. Others, particularly Carter's most devoted followers, dismissed the entire exchange as an anomaly, an isolated moment where their professor had simply been caught off guard. But even they could not ignore what had happened. The moment when the man they had once seen as untouchable had been forced to confront his own intellectual limitations. And for many students, it was the first time they had seen someone push back against the dominant narrative that faith was something to be outgrown, rather than understood. But perhaps the most profound impact of the debate was not in the immediate reaction, but in the quiet reflections it sparked. Students who had once dismissed faith entirely now found themselves reevaluating its place in human understanding. Some who had considered themselves firmly secular began reading about the philosophical and scientific arguments for the existence of God, discovering that many of the minds they had admired, scientists, philosophers, scholars, had grappled with these very same questions and found reason to believe. Even those who remained skeptical had to acknowledge that Barron had presented something worth considering: the idea that acknowledging the limits of human knowledge was not an intellectual failure, but a necessary step toward true wisdom. As for Professor Carter, the encounter left a mark on him that he could not shake. He had spent decades shaping young minds, believing he had all the answers, that faith was a crutch, that those who believed in God were merely holding on to outdated traditions. But Barron had forced him to confront something uncomfortable, that perhaps, in his relentless pursuit of intellectual dominance, he had become the very thing he had always criticized: someone who refused to question his own beliefs. In the privacy of his office, away from the eyes of his students, Carter found himself replaying the debate, hearing Barron's words echo in his mind. It was not anger he felt, not resentment, but something deeper: an unsettling realization that, for all his years of lecturing, for all his books and research, he had never truly considered the possibility that he might be wrong. This story, this debate, became more than just a single moment in an academic setting. It became a symbol of something larger: the idea that faith and reason were never meant to be at war, that they were two sides of the same coin, working together in humanity's search for meaning. In a world that often demands absolute certainty, Barron had offered something different: the recognition that true wisdom comes not from dismissing what we do not understand, but from having the humility to explore it. And for those who had been in that room, who had watched a student stand firm in his convictions while a professor struggled to maintain his own, the message was clear: sometimes the greatest strength lies not in proving that you are right, but in being willing to admit that you do not have all the answers. One of the most powerful lessons from this story is that faith and reason are not enemies but allies in the pursuit of truth. In today's world, where many people dismiss faith as outdated or irrelevant, Barron Trump's calm and logical defense serves as a reminder that belief in something greater does not equate to a lack of intelligence. Instead, it reflects humility, the recognition that human understanding has limits, and that there are mysteries in life that science alone cannot explain. This is a lesson that resonates deeply, especially for older generations who have witnessed how quickly society discards traditions in favor of modernity. Faith has been a guiding force for centuries, shaping communities, fostering resilience, and providing meaning in times of uncertainty. To dismiss it entirely is to ignore the wisdom that has stood the test of time. Another important takeaway is the power of standing firm in one's beliefs while engaging with others respectfully. In a world filled with heated debates and divisive arguments, Barron did not resort to anger or personal attacks. Instead, he met condescension with composure, mockery with logic, and arrogance with humility. This is a valuable lesson, particularly for those who feel unheard in today's fast-paced, ever-changing society. It shows that true confidence does not come from shouting the loudest, but from knowing what you believe and being able to defend it with grace. Finally, this story reminds us that intellectual humility is essential. No matter how much knowledge one accumulates, there will always be more to learn. The ability to admit that we do not have all the answers is not a weakness. It is a sign of true wisdom.